Hey, welcome to Q&A, where you ask your questions on faith and life, and I do my best to give a biblical perspective. Hey, as always, you can ask questions on slido.com. Use the hashtag ALC22. Would love to hear from you. We've been getting some really great questions recently, and certainly been stimulating, challenging for me. I hope that you've thought about them as well as you've listened to the responses. But as I say, if you've got questions about faith and life, drop us a line. Love to hear from you. Got a really good question that we're going to look at now. It's a question to be honest, I really can't do justice to in the time that we sort of set aside for this. It's probably something that really needs a good half hour to unpack, even half decently as an introduction, really. But just bear with me. Don't check out. It's a very important topic. I think it's a topic that we probably don't wrestle with enough. We probably think we're talking about the same things when we're not. So let's jump in and see where we get to. The question is social justice the same as justice in the Bible? If not, where is the line between them? And it's a good question, as I say, because so often we talk about biblical justice, social justice, we often think we're talking about the same things. And a lot of people would say that the social justice is just as biblical justice because we're concerned about the poor, the disadvantaged, and on it goes. So as I say, we don't really have time to really go into it, but the question is it the same, social justice the same as biblical justice? I want to say the short answer is no, they're not. And let me explain why. Essentially, biblical justice is for, you can think of biblical justice in two different ways, or it's defined in two different ways, perhaps would be a better way of putting it. The first is in terms of the whole thing of retribution, an eye for an eye. You do this, you are going to be punished for it. It's fairly straightforward. We understand that. The second dimension to justice in the Bible is what we would call restorative. It's basically if you take something, you have to give it back. And if you can't, then you have to make it good. So, for example, the Bible talks about how if you take your neighbor's ox, then you have to return it. If you can't return it, then you have to give them that ox, but replace that ox, and on it goes. So, biblical justice is about retribution. It's about restoration. Social justice, on the other hand, if we want to be really fair to social justice and if we're being honest with ourselves, it's really redistributive, and it's at its heart, and it's about equality, not about equity, but about equality. Basically, at its heart, it's what it seeks to do is to take resources from one group and give them to those without, so that everybody has the same. It's a form of cultural Marxism. Of course, no one would want to call it that because then people would push back against it. But if you were to really analyze social justice as it plays out, particularly in the West, particularly in the United States, and Marxism, you'd find very little difference between them. You see, the problem is that it works by pitting two groups of people against each other. You divide them and then you pit them against each other. In this context, it's the haves versus the have-nots. And the haves and the have-nots can be over anything. It's not just economic. It could be based on race. It could be based on sexuality. It could be based on any number of criteria. But essentially, it's dividing people into haves and have-nots, and then seeking to redistribute the perceived rights and advantages of the haves to the have-nots so that everybody's equal. And so that's why I say it's not the same. At its heart, biblical justice is when it thinks of what's right, what's wrong, it's being defined by God. And so it's unchanging. It stands outside of what we may think is appropriate. God has determined, the scriptures have determined, whereas social justice is being defined by society. And so as society changes and adapts itself to meet its own desires, now, not necessarily the desires that what is best for us, but what we desire for ourselves, then social justice is defined accordingly. So whereas biblical justice is blind in the sense that if it's wrong for everybody. If there's no partiality, there's no favoritism. In fact, in Leviticus 19:15, let me just bring it up. I know, here it is here. Do not pervert justice. Do not show partiality to the poor or favoritism to the great, but judge your neighbor fairly. So it's blind in that sense. It's regardless of someone's socioeconomic status, you treat everybody the same. Whereas social justice is intentionally biased or partial to a particular group. It prioritizes one group over another. So you can see that where that line is between them. You ask, where is the line between the two? Well, that's where I would draw the line. And it's not just where I would draw the line. That's where the line has been drawn by a lot of biblical scholars. There was a time, I think, when you could say that there was huge overlap between social justice and biblical justice. There was a time when the focus of social justice was around things like slavery, child exploitation, poverty, and the Bible has a lot to say about those. But social justice now it's not really about those sorts of issues. Social justice at its heart now is more of a political movement, more of a worldview than it is about being issues of justice. At its heart, social justice, particularly in the West, and I do want to say the West, I can't comment outside of that, has become more about deconstructing colonialism or white privilege and redistributing that to minorities. So we see in America, for example, and we see it here in New Zealand, we're seeing it in most Western countries now where if you're white or were seen as part of the the colonizers, you're seen as privileged, you're seen as being entitled, you're seen as having power, and therefore social justice seeks to intentionally remove that and give it to minorities. So it makes moral judgments on a moment by moment basis, not on the basis of some universal moral code such as the Ten Commandments. And that's why I think it's very dangerous. And I think Christians need to be very clear that when we talk about social justice, clarifying terms, are we talking about it from the biblical perspective, which is justice, the justice for the orphan, for the widow, for the poor, for the immigrant, for the foreigner? Or are we talking about social justice which is from the cultural point of view, from mainstream point of view, which is more of a movement, more of a worldview than it is about justice in and of itself? The two don't overlap the way they once did. It's easy to spot. For example, in the Bible, justice is very, very clearly defined. So, for example, in the Bible, justice defines that a charge be witnessed or supported by two or more witnesses in Deuteronomy 17. So someone just can't stand up and say, I've got a problem with this person, and create a scene and have that person struck off, so to speak. Whereas look at what happens today in the social justice movement, which is more of a worldview, a philosophy, a political movement than it is a justice movement as such. If you disagree with someone, we see it characterized by cancel culture. Whether the person, whether it's warranted or not is not the issue. The issue is we've decided now we don't like that person's views, we cancel it. So we could go on, but I hope that highlights why I say that biblical justice and social justice as it's defined today are not the same. They don't overlap in the way they once did. The line is very clear. Justice is defined by God. Social justice is defined by whatever society feels is right at any particular moment. The goals of justice are to satisfy the demands of the law for people, to make sure that people aren't abused, and if they have been wronged, that wrong is made right. Whereas social justice is about pitting people against each other and about taking what is perceived as an advantage of one group and giving it to another, whether they are deserving of it, whether they have earned it, whatever. So you can see that, I can understand why social justice is attractive. I just don't think they're going about it the right way. As I say, we could go on. We probably need more time to unpack it and go into more detail to clarify where the lines are. But I hope that gives you an overview and an indication of what you need to think about if you want to get your head around this, and how you should be thinking in terms of recognizing where the line is and where it gets crossed and how it gets crossed, so that you don't get caught up in it and to be found on the wrong side of biblical justice. So yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, but those are mine. As I said, if you've got questions about faith and life, as always, you can post them on slido.com. Use the hashtag ALC22. But that's it for now. Until next time, God bless.